The scream tore through the great hall before anyone could stop it. Lyra was on her knees, dragged there by 2 guards who did not meet her eyes, while King Draven sat above her on a throne carved from black mountain stone, his face unreadable, his jaw locked tight. Smoke still clung to his fur-lined cloak from the battle 3 nights past, when the rival Blackthorn pack had stormed the eastern gate and killed 11 of his best warriors while they slept. "She was seen near the gate before the attack," said Counselor Aldrich, his voice slicing through the silence like a blade drawn slowly from its sheath. "She is the only Omega with access to the watch schedules. The traitor who let them in wears her face." "That is a lie," Lyra said, her voice shaking but not breaking. "I was in the healing house all night. Ask the healer. Ask anyone." Nobody answered her. Nobody dared, not with Aldrich standing so close to the throne, his hand resting on Draven's shoulder like a man who had already won. Draven said nothing for a long moment. He looked older than his years, hollowed out by grief, his silver eyes dull with exhaustion. Lyra searched his face for something, some flicker of memory, some proof that the nights they had spent together meant anything to him at all. She found nothing. He looked at her the way a man looks at a stranger accused of a crime he has no patience to investigate. "Banish her," he said finally, and the words fell like stones into still water. "Before sundown. She does not return to Ashwood territory. If she is seen within these borders again, the punishment will be death." The hall erupted into murmurs, but Lyra heard none of it. She heard only the sound of her own heart breaking, the sound of a decision made without a trial, without mercy, without a single question asked in her defense. She rose to her feet on legs that barely held her, refusing to let them see her fall. "You will regret this," she whispered, so quietly that only Draven could hear it. "Not because of what happens to me, but because of what you are throwing away." He did not answer. He turned his face aside, and that was the last time she saw him look at her for many years. The guards marched her through the village square, past the bakery where she used to buy warm bread on cold mornings, past the training yard, where she had once watched Draven spar with his brothers before the crown weighed so heavily on him, past every place that had once felt like home. Villagers stepped aside, some with pity in their eyes, most with the careful blankness of people who did not want to be associated with a woman accused of treason. At the northern gate, the guards stopped and removed her cloak pin, the one bearing the crest of Ashwood, the mark of belonging. They did not speak to her, they simply pointed toward the mountains, dark and jagged against the darkening sky, and turned their backs. Lyra stood at the border for a long moment, feeling the wind cut through her thin dress, feeling the last warmth of the village fires fade behind her. She placed a hand against her stomach, a secret she had told no one, not even the man who had cast her out without asking a single question about the child growing inside her. "They will never know what they lost," she said to the wind, and then she walked into the mountains alone, leaving behind everything she had ever known. The first night was the hardest. She found shelter beneath a rocky outcrop, shivering through hours of bitter cold, listening to the distant howls of wolves that were not her pack, wolves that owed her no loyalty and offered no protection. She did not shift, not yet. Her wolf form was too weak from stress, too tangled up in grief to answer her call. She simply curled into herself and waited for morning, praying to whatever spirits watched over exiles that she would survive the night. By the second day, hunger had become a constant companion. She foraged for berries she barely remembered how to identify, drank from icy streams that numbed her hands, and pressed onward, higher into the mountains, away from any trail that might lead searchers back to Ashwood. She told herself this was not fear. She told herself she simply wanted distance, wanted silence, wanted a place where no one would ever again look at her and see a traitor instead of a woman who had done nothing wrong. On the 4th day, she found the cabin. It stood at the edge of a ridge, half swallowed by pine trees, its wooden walls gray and weathered but still standing, its roof intact despite years of harsh mountain winters. It had clearly belonged to a ranger or hunter long since gone, someone who had left behind a few tools, a rusted cooking pot, and a stone hearth that still held the promise of warmth if she could coax a fire back to life. Lyra stood in the doorway for a long time before stepping inside. This was not Ashwood. This was not the palace with its polished floors and warm furs. But it was hers, and no one could take it from her, and for the first time since the trial, she allowed herself to cry. She spent the following weeks turning the cabin into something livable, She patched holes in the roof with bark and mud, cleared years of dust and debris from the single room, and set traps for small game, using techniques her grandmother had taught her long before she ever set foot in a royal court. She was not helpless. She had never been helpless. She had simply been underestimated, dismissed as gentle, as soft, as someone who could be discarded without consequence. The mountain did not care about titles or bloodlines. It only cared about strength, and Lyra discovered, slowly and painfully, that she had more strength than anyone at Ashwood had ever given her credit for. Word did not travel far into the high mountains, but rumors still found their way to isolated villages, scattered along the lower slopes. Lyra learned, through careful and quiet conversations with a trader who passed through twice a season, that the true trader who had opened the gate to the Blackthorn pack was still walking free within Ashwood's walls, protected by powerful allies who benefited from the chaos of that night. She learned that Councillor Aldrich had gained significant influence in the weeks following her banishment, stepping into roles left vacant by warriors who had died in the attack. She was not surprised. She had suspected, even in that final moment in the Great Hall, that the accusation against her had less to do with guilt and more to do with convenience. Someone needed to be blamed. She had simply been the easiest target, an Omega with no powerful family to defend her, no political weight to throw against the accusation. But dwelling on injustice would not keep her fed through the winter, and it would not protect the life growing inside her. So Lyra pushed the anger down, buried it beneath layers of practical necessity, and focused instead on preparing for what was coming. She built a second room onto the cabin, using timber she cut herself, slow and careful work that left her hands calloused and her muscles aching in ways she had never experienced within the soft comforts of palace life. She stockpiled dried meat and preserved berries, learned which roots could ease pain and which herbs could bring down a fever, and slowly transformed herself from a banished Omega into something the mountain itself seemed to respect. Some nights, when the wind howled around the cabin and loneliness pressed in from every direction, she allowed herself to think of Draven, not the king who had condemned her without a trial, but the man she remembered from quieter moments, before the crown had hardened him, before politics had taught him to keep everyone at arm's length. She wondered if he ever thought of her, if he had asked a single question about her fate after the guards marched her away, or if he had simply returned to his throne and let the matter fade from his mind like smoke dispersing into open sky. She decided, somewhere in the depths of that first mountain winter, that it did not matter. Whatever Draven thought or felt, whatever guilt he carried or did not carry, none of it would change her path forward. She was going to survive. She was going to build a life on this mountain, far from thrones and councils and men who mistook silence for guilt. And she was going to protect the child growing inside her with everything she had, no matter what it cost her. The snow fell heavier as the season deepened, blanketing the mountain in silence so complete that Lyra sometimes forgot the sound of other voices entirely. She grew accustomed to talking to herself, to the wind, to the distant wolves whose howls no longer frightened her, but instead felt strangely comforting, like company from creatures who understood exile better than any human court ever could. She practiced her shift more frequently as her strength returned, feeling her wolf form settle into something steadier, something more controlled than the frightened, grief-stricken creature she had been in those first terrible days after her banishment. Her wolf was pale silver, almost white against the snow, a color that had once marked her as delicate and ornamental within Ashwood's court, but now served as perfect camouflage against the mountain's harshest season. She hunted small game with growing confidence, her senses sharpening with each passing week, her body adapting to a life of constant vigilance and self-reliance. She was not the same woman who had knelt trembling before Draven's throne. That woman had died somewhere on the mountain trail, replaced by someone harder, wiser, and far less willing to accept judgment from anyone who had not earned the right to judge her. As her pregnancy progressed, Lyra found herself talking to the children she carried, describing the mountain to them in soft, steady tones as she worked through her daily tasks. She told them about the way morning light broke through the pine trees, scattering gold across the snow. She told them about the stream that never fully froze, even in the coldest months, its water clear and cold and alive, with tiny fish that darted beneath the ice at the edges. She told them, though she was not entirely certain they could understand her yet, that they would grow up strong and free, untouched by the poison of a court that had discarded their mother without a second thought. She never once considered returning to Ashwood, not even when loneliness pressed hardest against her resolve. She had built something here that no council, no accusation, no careless king could take from her. She had built a home. The final weeks of winter brought the harshest storms yet, powerful winds that rattled the cabin walls, and snow that piled high enough to bury the door each morning. Lyra worked through the discomfort of her growing belly, reinforcing the cabin's structure, gathering extra firewood, and preparing every possible contingency for a birth that would come without healers, without attendants, without anyone beside her but the mountain itself. She was frightened, in the quiet moments, when exhaustion stripped away her carefully maintained composure. But beneath the fear ran something stronger, a fierce and unshakable determination that had been growing within her since the moment the guards had pointed her toward the mountains and turned their backs. She would not break. She had already survived the worst thing anyone had ever done to her, and she intended to survive whatever came next, for her own sake and for the sake of the children, who would soon draw their first breath in a world that had already tried, and failed, to destroy their mother before they were even born. As the last frost of winter began to loosen its grip on the mountain, Lyra felt the first true pains of labor arrive, sudden and sharp, stealing the breath from her lungs. She gripped the edge of the wooden table she had built with her own hands, and breathed through the pain, exactly as she had prepared herself to do, alone, determined, and entirely unafraid of what the mountain still had left to test her with. Outside, the wind began to rise again, carrying with it the distant, mournful sound of wolves calling across the ridges, as though the mountain itself understood that something important was about to happen within the walls of that small, weathered cabin. The pain came in waves so powerful that Lyra lost track of time entirely, the hours blurring together into a single continuous struggle, lit only by the flickering light of the hearth fire she had stoked before her strength gave out. She had prepared as best she could, boiling water, laying out clean cloth, positioning herself near enough to the fire that the cold could not reach her, but nothing could have truly prepared her for the reality of bringing life into the world alone, without a healer's steady hands or a mother's comforting voice to guide her through it. She gritted her teeth against a fresh wave of pain and thought of her own mother, long past, who had once told her that the women of their bloodline were built from mountain stone, unbreakable no matter how hard the world pressed against them. Lyra held on to those words like a lifeline as the storm outside grew fiercer, wind screaming against the cabin walls as if the mountain itself were laboring alongside her. Hours passed in a haze of exhaustion and determination. When the first cry finally broke through the howling wind, Lyra nearly wept with relief, cradling the small, warm bundle against her chest, before realizing, with a jolt of surprise that cut through her exhaustion, that the pain was not yet finished. A second child was coming. She had not known. She had felt only one heartbeat during the long months of her pregnancy, had prepared herself for a single child, and now found herself facing an entirely unexpected second labor, with barely a moment to catch her breath. But whatever fear tried to claim her, she pushed it aside, focused instead on the task in front of her, and less than an hour later, a second cry joined the first, filling the small cabin with a sound so full of life that it seemed to push back against the storm itself. Lyra lay back against the furs she had prepared, two small bundles now resting against her chest, both breathing steadily, both impossibly small and impossibly precious. She looked down at their faces in the dim firelight, exhaustion pulling at every part of her body, and felt something shift inside her chest. A fierce and overwhelming love that eclipsed every hardship she had endured to reach this moment. The boy had a shock of dark hair and a strong, steady cry. The girl was quieter, watching the firelight with wide, curious eyes, even in her first hours of life. Lyra studied their faces carefully, searching for traces of herself in their small features, and then she saw it. Unmistakable, even in newborns barely an hour old. Their eyes were silver. Not the pale gray of ordinary wolves, but a distinct, striking silver that she had seen in only one other face in her entire life. Draven's eyes. The eyes of a king, who did not even know these children existed, who had cast their mother into exile, without ever learning that a piece of him would grow up on a mountain, far from any throne. For a moment, old grief threatened to overwhelm her, grief for the life these children might have had if the court had not turned against her, if Draven had asked even a single question before condemning her. But she pushed the thought away, holding her children closer, and made a silent vow that would guide every decision she made for the rest of her life. They would never know the cruelty of that court. They would never bow to a council, that valued convenience over truth. They would grow up here, on this mountain, strong and free, and untouched by the poison that had nearly destroyed their mother. She named the boy Kale, a name she had once heard from an old mountain trader, meaning fierce and unyielding. She named the girl Wren, after the small, resilient birds that had somehow survived even the harshest winter storms, just outside her cabin window, singing each morning, as though the cold meant nothing to them at all. The storm outside began to quiet as dawn approached, the wind softening into gentle gusts that no longer rattled the cabin walls with violence. Lyra watched her children sleep, exhaustion finally pulling her toward rest as well. But even as sleep claimed her, she felt a deep and unshakable certainty settle over her heart. Whatever came next, whatever challenges the mountain still held in store, she would face them with her twins beside her, and together, they would build a life that no court, no king, and no cruel accusation could ever take away. The weeks following the birth tested Lyra in ways she had never anticipated. Caring for two newborns alone in a remote mountain cabin left little room for rest, and she quickly learned to function through exhaustion so complete that entire days blurred together into a fog of feeding, soothing, and desperately trying to keep the fire burning through cold nights. But even in the depths of that exhaustion, she found moments of pure joy that made every hardship worthwhile. Watching Kale's small fists curl tightly around her finger, listening to Wren's soft coos as she studied the shifting shadows on the cabin walls. She adapted her daily routines around her children's needs, carrying them close against her body in a sling she fashioned from soft hide while she tended traps and gathered firewood, teaching herself to work efficiently during their brief naps, and slowly building a rhythm to mountain life that included two small, growing presences at its very center. As the twins grew from newborns into curious infants, Lyra noticed something remarkable. They seemed unusually attuned to their environment, responding to sounds and movements with an alertness that felt far beyond what she remembered from other pack children she had observed during her years at Ashwood. She wondered, sometimes, if this heightened awareness came from growing up surrounded by the raw wilderness of the mountain, or if it was simply a trait inherited from a bloodline she had never fully understood. She kept careful watch for any sign of danger, wary of predators that might see two small children as easy prey. But she also began teaching them, even in those earliest months, the sounds and signals of the mountain around them. She spoke to them constantly, describing the world in rich detail, naming every plant and animal they encountered, weaving stories about the stars that emerged each night above the tree line. By the time the twins reached their first year, Lyra had transformed the cabin into something resembling a true home. She had expanded the garden she cultivated during warmer months, growing hardy vegetables that supplemented the meat and fish she continued to hunt and gather. She had built small wooden toys for Kale and Wren using scraps of leftover timber, watching with quiet pride as they explored their world with growing confidence and curiosity. She never spoke of Ashwood, never mentioned the throne or the court, or the man whose eyes stared back at her every time she looked into her children's faces. As far as Lyra was concerned, that life belonged to a different woman entirely, someone who no longer existed, replaced by the fierce and capable mother who had built a new world on this mountain, from nothing but determination and raw survival instinct. Still, some nights, after the twins had finally drifted into sleep, Lyra found herself standing at the cabin window, staring out at the distant horizon, where Ashwood's lights sometimes glowed faintly against the night sky. She wondered, in those quiet moments, whether the truth of that terrible night had ever come to light, whether the true traitor still walked free within the palace walls, protected by allies who had benefited from her downfall. She wondered if Draven ever thought of her at all. But those thoughts never lingered long. She had children to raise, a life to build, and a mountain that demanded her full attention if she wanted to keep her family safe and thriving. Whatever happened within the walls of Ashwood was no longer her concern. Her world had narrowed to this small cabin, this rugged mountain, and the two remarkable children who filled her days with purpose, and her heart with a love more powerful than any grief she had carried out of that great hall on the day of her banishment. As the first anniversary of their birth approached, Lyra watched her twins take their first unsteady steps across the cabin floor, laughing with pure delight as they toppled into each other's arms. She felt, in that moment, a profound and quiet certainty that she had made the right choice in refusing to let bitterness define the rest of her life. Whatever the future held, whatever storms still waited on the horizon, She would face them with her children beside her, strong and unbowed, exactly as the mountain had taught her to be. 6 years passed on the mountain, each season shaping Kale and Ren into children who moved through the wilderness with a confidence that startled even the wandering trappers, who occasionally caught glimpses of them from a distance. By the time they reached their 6th birthday, they had already learned to track deer through fresh snow, identify which berries were safe to eat, and shift into their wolf forms with a smoothness that Lyra herself had struggled to master until well into her adult years. Kale had grown tall for his age, lean and quick, with an instinct for climbing that left Lyra's heart in her throat more often than she cared to admit. He approached every challenge with a fierce determination, refusing to back down from difficult tasks, even when his small body could not yet match his ambition. Ren, by contrast, moved through the world with quiet observation, often noticing details that escaped both her mother and her brother, reading the subtle signs of weather shifts in the way clouds gathered above the peaks, or the way birds fell suddenly silent before a storm. Together, they balanced each other perfectly, and Lyra often found herself marveling at how naturally they had grown into their roles, Kale leading with bold confidence, Ren following with careful precision, each one making the other stronger. She had built a life for them that felt, in many ways, complete. The cabin had grown over the years, expanded with additional rooms and a sturdier roof that could withstand even the fiercest mountain storms. She had established quiet trade relationships with a small village nestled at the base of the mountain, exchanging furs and dried herbs for salt, cloth, and the occasional book that she used to teach her children letters and numbers during long winter evenings. The villagers knew her only as a solitary woman who lived high in the mountains with her 2 children, a woman skilled in herbal medicine and animal tracking, who occasionally appeared in their market square to trade goods before disappearing again into the wilderness. They called her the Mountain Woman, sometimes with genuine respect, sometimes with the wary curiosity, reserved for those who chose isolation over community. Lyra never corrected their assumptions, or shared details of her past. The fewer people who knew her true history, the safer her children remained. Kale and Ren grew up believing their mother had always lived on the mountain, that no other life had ever existed for their small family. They asked occasional questions about their father, as children often do, but Lyra had prepared careful, gentle answers that satisfied their curiosity, without revealing painful truths they were not yet ready to understand. "Your father lives far from here," she told them once, during a quiet evening beside the fire, "in a place with very different rules than our mountain. Someday, perhaps, you will understand more. For now, know only that you are loved completely, and that is enough." The twins accepted this answer with the easy acceptance of young children, more interested in the adventures waiting for them outside the cabin door than in questions about distant places they had never seen. As they grew older, Lyra began teaching them more advanced skills, training their instincts for combat and defense, not out of any specific fear, but out of a fierce determination to ensure they could protect themselves against whatever dangers the mountain, or the wider world, might one day present. She taught them to read the subtle signs of predators approaching, to move silently through underbrush, to defend themselves against threats both physical and otherwise. She also taught them compassion, perhaps her most important lesson of all. She showed them how to nurse injured animals back to health, how to share what little surplus they had with struggling travelers who occasionally passed through the lower slopes, how to extend kindness, even to strangers who had done nothing to earn it. She wanted her children to grow up strong, yes, but she wanted them to grow up good, untouched by the cruelty and political maneuvering that had once destroyed her own life. Kale, in particular, seemed to absorb these lessons with unexpected depth. Despite his bold and sometimes reckless nature, he demonstrated a natural protectiveness towards smaller creatures, once spending an entire week nursing an injured fox kit back to health, despite Lyra's gentle warnings that the kit might not survive. When it finally recovered and bounded off into the forest, Kale had beamed with a pride so genuine that Lyra felt tears prick at her eyes, recognizing in that moment the good heart she had worked so hard to cultivate within him. Ren, meanwhile, developed a quiet talent for understanding the mountain's rhythms in ways that even Lyra found remarkable. She could predict storms hours before they arrived, sense the presence of other wolves long before they came into view, and seemed to communicate with the natural world around her in ways that went beyond simple observation. Lyra sometimes wondered if this heightened sensitivity came from growing up so completely immersed in wilderness, or if it reflected something deeper within her daughter's nature, something inherited from a bloodline neither of them fully understood. The years brought their share of hardships as well. A particularly brutal winter during their 4th year on the mountain nearly claimed all 3 of them, forcing Lyra to make impossible decisions about rationing food and firewood, watching anxiously as her children grew thin during the leanest months before spring finally arrived. A summer drought during their 5th year threatened their garden and forced them to range farther than usual in search of reliable water sources. Through each challenge, Lyra drew on reserves of strength she had not known she possessed, determined to keep her family safe no matter what obstacles the mountain presented. She never once regretted her choice to remain in exile. Whatever comfort or security she might have found by seeking reconciliation with Ashwood, she knew it would have come at too high a cost, forcing her children to grow up within a court that had already proven itself capable of tremendous cruelty toward innocent people. Here, on the mountain, they were free. Free from political maneuvering, free from judgment based on rank or bloodline, free to become exactly who they were meant to be, without the weight of a throne's expectations pressing down upon them. As Kale and Ren approached their 7th year, Lyra began to notice subtle changes in their abilities that went beyond typical childhood development. Their shifts between human and wolf form became faster, more fluid, requiring less concentration than she remembered needing at their age. Their senses seemed unusually sharp, capable of detecting movement and scent from remarkable distances. She wondered, with a mixture of pride and quiet concern, whether these heightened abilities stemmed from the unique combination of their bloodline, or simply from a childhood spent almost entirely within the wild, unstructured freedom of mountain life. Whatever the cause, she watched her children grow with a fierce and protective love, grateful every single day that she had found the strength to build this life for them, far from a throne that had once tried to destroy her before they ever had the chance to exist. One crisp autumn morning, as golden light filtered through the changing leaves, Lyra watched Kale and Ren race each other across a mountain meadow in their wolf forms, silver-tinged fur catching the sunlight as they moved with a grace and speed that seemed almost otherworldly. She smiled, feeling a deep contentment settle over her heart despite everything she had lost to reach this moment. Whatever challenges still waited on the horizon, whatever truths still remained buried within Ashwood's walls, she knew, with unwavering certainty, that she had given her children something precious and irreplaceable. A childhood built on freedom, resilience, and unconditional love, untouched by the poison of a court that had once tried to break her. She had built this life from nothing, out of exile and heartbreak, and watching her twins now, strong and free and utterly unafraid of the world around them, she knew without a doubt that it had all been worth it. 9 years after the night of her banishment, Lyra stood at the edge of her garden, watching Kale and Ren spar in their human forms beneath the late afternoon sun, their movements sharp and disciplined, refined through years of daily practice. They were no longer the small, uncertain children who had taken their first wobbling steps across the cabin floor. They stood tall now, lean and strong, their silver eyes flashing with focus as they traded careful blows, each one testing the other's reflexes without any true intent to harm. Lyra allowed herself a rare moment of stillness, watching her children with quiet pride. The mountain had shaped them into something remarkable, capable, and confident in ways that few pack-raised children could ever hope to match. They had never known the comfort of servants or the safety of guarded walls, and yet they carried themselves with a natural authority that seemed almost inherited, a quiet strength that Lyra recognized, with a familiar pang in her chest, from another face she had spent 9 years trying to forget. Life had settled into a steady rhythm over the years. The cabin had grown into a small, sturdy homestead, complete with a proper barn for the goats they had acquired through trade, an expanded garden that provided the bulk of their food during warmer months, and a small workshop where Kale had begun learning basic carpentry from an old trapper who occasionally passed through the region. Ren had developed a genuine talent for herbalism, expanding on the knowledge Lyra had taught her until she could identify remedies for ailments that even Lyra herself struggled to recognize. The village at the base of the mountain had grown more familiar with them over the years as well. Lyra traded regularly now, exchanging herbs, furs, and carved wooden goods for supplies they could not produce themselves. The villagers had grown to respect the quiet, capable family that lived high in the mountains, occasionally seeking Lyra's help when illness struck their own community, trusting her healing knowledge even though they knew almost nothing about her past. It was during one such visit to the village that Lyra first heard whispers that made her blood run cold. An older trader, a woman named Ellen who had grown fond of Lyra over the years of exchanging goods, pulled her aside near the edge of the market square, glancing around cautiously before speaking in a low voice. "There's word coming down from Ashwood," Ellen said. "Rumors of trouble within the King's Council. Some say there's been an investigation. Something about the attack years back, the one that led to that whole banishment business." She paused, studying Lyra's carefully neutral expression. "You lived up that way once, didn't you? Before you came to the mountain." Lyra kept her voice steady, betraying nothing of the sudden tension gripping her chest. "A long time ago. What kind of investigation?" Ellen shrugged, though her eyes remained sharp with curiosity. "Details are scarce, something about evidence surfacing that wasn't available before. People say the king's been different since it started. Quieter, some say guilt-ridden, though nobody dares say why out loud." Lyra thanked Ellen for the information and made her way back up the mountain trail with a heavier heart than she had carried in years. She had spent nearly a decade building a life entirely separate from Ashwood, convincing herself that the past held no power over her present. But Ellen's words had cracked open a door she thought she had sealed shut permanently, and she found herself wondering, despite every effort to resist the thought, whether the truth of that terrible night had finally begun to surface. She said nothing to Cale and Wren about the rumors, unwilling to disturb the careful peace she had built for them. But that night, after they had fallen asleep, she sat alone by the dying embers of the hearth fire, memories she had spent years suppressing, rising unbidden to the surface. She remembered the cold dismissal in Draven's eyes as he pronounced her sentence. She remembered the guard's careful blankness as they marched her toward the northern gate. She remembered, most painfully of all, the way no one in that entire great hall had spoken up in her defense, not even the man who had once claimed to love her. Whatever guilt Draven might be carrying now, nearly a decade too late, Lyra felt no immediate sympathy for it. He had condemned her without a trial, without a single question asked in her favor. If the truth was finally surfacing, it was surfacing far too late to undo the years of hardship she had endured, far too late to give back the childhood her children might have had within a proper pack, surrounded by extended family, instead of isolated on a mountain, with only their mother for company. And yet, despite her lingering resentment, Lyra could not entirely silence a small, persistent thought that crept into her mind, as the fire finally burned down to glowing coals. If the truth was surfacing, if the real traitor was finally being exposed, did that not mean her children's true heritage might eventually come to light as well? And if it did, how long could she realistically expect to keep that heritage hidden from them? She pushed the thought aside, telling herself that such worries belonged to some distant, uncertain future, not to the peaceful life she had carefully built on this mountain. Ashwood's politics were no longer her concern. Whatever happened within those palace walls, her family remained safe and hidden, far beyond the reach of any court intrigue. But the rumors did not fade, and over the following months, Lyra heard increasingly detailed reports each time she visited the village. The investigation had apparently uncovered evidence pointing toward Counselor Aldrich, the very man who had first accused her before the entire court nearly a decade earlier. Witnesses had come forward, testimonies had been gathered, and King Draven himself had reportedly ordered a thorough re-examination of the night the Blackthorn pack breached Ashwood's gates. Lyra listened to these updates with a complicated mixture of vindication and lingering anger. Part of her felt a fierce satisfaction at the thought of Aldrich finally facing consequences for the lies that had destroyed nearly a decade of her life. But another part of her, the part that still remembered the sting of Draven's cold dismissal, refused to feel any warmth toward a king who had been so quick to condemn her, and so slow to seek the truth. As autumn deepened into winter that year, Lyra noticed subtle changes in Cale and Wren's behavior that suggested they, too, sensed something shifting in the air, though neither of them understood the true source of their mother's occasional distraction. Cale grew more curious about the world beyond the mountain, asking increasingly detailed questions about other packs, other territories, and the political structures that governed pack society. Wren, ever perceptive, seemed to sense her mother's unspoken tension, offering quiet comfort in small gestures, an extra cup of tea prepared without being asked, a gentle hand on Lyra's shoulder during moments of visible distraction. Lyra did her best to maintain the peaceful rhythm of their daily life, refusing to let old wounds disrupt the careful world she had built for her children. But she found herself, more often than she cared to admit, standing at the cabin window in the evenings, staring out toward the distant horizon, where Ashwood's lights glowed faintly against the darkening sky, wondering what truths were finally coming to light within those palace walls, and wondering, with a complicated tangle of emotions she could not fully untangle, what it might mean for the future she had worked so hard to protect. She told herself, again and again, that whatever happened in Ashwood would remain entirely separate from her mountain life. She told herself that her children were safe, that the past could not reach them here, that nearly a decade of careful isolation had built walls strong enough to withstand any storm that might still be brewing in the valley below. She did not yet know how wrong she was. Within the stone walls of Ashwood, King Draven sat alone in his private study, long after the rest of the palace had fallen silent for the night, a stack of documents spread across his desk, each page adding another piece to a puzzle he had spent nearly a decade avoiding. The candlelight flickered against his tired face, illuminating lines that had not existed 9 years earlier, evidence of a burden he had carried in silence for far too long. It had started with a deathbed confession. An aging guard named Halden, one of the men who had been stationed near the eastern gate on the night of the Blackthorn attack, had summoned Draven personally as illness claimed the final weeks of his life. What Halden revealed in that quiet, private meeting had shattered the fragile peace Draven had constructed around the memory of that terrible night. Halden confessed that he had witnessed Counselor Aldrich near the eastern gate hours before the attack, engaged in a hushed conversation with a stranger who had since been identified as a Blackthorn scout. At the time, fear of Aldrich's growing political power had kept Halden silent, watching in horror as the subsequent investigation placed blame squarely on an innocent Omega instead of the true architect of that night's devastation. "I should have spoken sooner," Halden had whispered, his voice weak with illness and years of guilt. "I told myself it wasn't my place, that the council would sort out the truth eventually, but I was wrong, and an innocent woman paid the price for my silence. I could not go to my grave without finally telling someone the truth." Draven had sat with that confession for weeks, unable to fully process the weight of what it meant. He had ordered his own investigation, quietly and carefully, unwilling to give Aldrich any warning that might allow him to cover his tracks further. Over the following months, additional evidence surfaced, other witnesses who had remained silent out of fear, financial records suggesting Aldrich had received substantial payment around the time of the attack, and testimony from a captured Blackthorn soldier who confirmed that someone within Ashwood's own council had facilitated their access to the eastern gate. The truth, once fully assembled, painted a devastating picture. Aldrich had orchestrated the entire attack, seeking to eliminate rival warriors who threatened his political ambitions, while simultaneously positioning himself to gain influence in the chaos that followed. And when suspicion needed to fall somewhere, he had chosen the easiest target available, an Omega with no powerful family connections to protect her, someone who could be discarded without any real political cost. Draven had condemned her without asking a single meaningful question, blinded by grief and manipulated by a counselor he had trusted far too completely. The realization sat like a stone in his chest, heavier with each passing day, as the full scope of his failure became clear. He thought of Lara constantly now, memories he had spent years trying to suppress rising unbidden at every quiet moment. He remembered her gentle nature, her quick intelligence, the way she had once looked at him with genuine warmth before the crown had taught him to keep everyone at careful distance. He remembered, with fresh and painful clarity, the moment he had looked away from her pleading eyes and pronounced her banishment, choosing the easy path of decisive action over the harder path of genuine investigation. He had searched for her, quietly and persistently, over the following months, as the evidence against Aldrich solidified. He sent trusted scouts into the surrounding territories, inquiring discreetly about any sign of a solitary Omega who might have settled in the region, following her exile nearly a decade earlier. Whatever path Lyra had taken after leaving Ashwood's borders, she had covered her tracks well, leaving no trace for his scouts to follow. Draven began to fear that she might not have survived the harsh mountain wilderness at all, that his failure to protect her had ultimately cost her life entirely. The thought haunted him through sleepless nights, guilt compounding upon guilt, until he barely recognized the reflection that stared back at him in quiet moments of rare stillness. He confronted Aldrich directly, once the evidence became undeniable, watching with cold satisfaction as the counselors carefully maintained composure, finally cracked under the weight of irrefutable proof. Aldrich did not deny the accusations once cornered, instead offering a bitter justification about necessary sacrifices and political survival that only deepened Draven's disgust. She was convenient, Aldrich had said, his voice devoid of any genuine remorse. An Omega with no allies, no family to demand justice. I did what was necessary to protect my position, and you were far too eager to believe the simplest explanation, rather than dig deeper into the truth. Draven had Aldrich stripped of his title and imprisoned, though no punishment could fully undo the years of suffering his lies had caused. The council was restructured, loyal advisors replacing those who had benefited from Aldrich's manipulations, and Draven began the slow, difficult process of rebuilding trust within a court that had nearly been destroyed by one man's ruthless ambition. But restructuring the council did nothing to address the deeper wound that continued to haunt him. Somewhere beyond Ashwood's borders, if she still lived at all, Lyra carried the weight of an injustice he had failed to prevent. He owed her more than a quiet acknowledgement of wrongdoing whispered within palace walls. He owed her a public reckoning, a genuine attempt at making amends, and above all, he owed her the truth that he had never stopped regretting the moment he turned his face away from her and condemned her to exile. He intensified his search efforts as the months passed, sending scouts further into the mountain ranges, offering rewards to traders and travelers who might have information about a solitary Omega living somewhere in the wilderness. He grew increasingly restless within the palace, finding little satisfaction in the daily governance that had once consumed his full attention. His advisors noticed the change, whispering among themselves about the king's uncharacteristic distraction, though none dared question him directly about the source of his growing unease. Draven found himself, more often than he cared to admit, standing at his study window in the late hours of night, staring out toward the distant mountain peaks that separated Ashwood from the surrounding wilderness. He wondered if Lyra had survived those unforgiving slopes. He wondered if she had found safety, or if his failure had ultimately led to a tragedy he would never fully understand or atone for. He wondered, with a persistent ache he could not silence, whether she had ever forgiven him, or whether she had spent every day since her banishment nursing a hatred he had more than earned. He did not yet know that somewhere within those distant mountains, two children with his own silver eyes were growing up strong and capable, under the careful guidance of the very woman he had wronged. He did not yet know that fate, in its own patient and unpredictable way, was already weaving the threads that would eventually bring them all together, in circumstances none of them could have anticipated. As winter settled over Ashwood once more, nearly a decade after that fateful night in the Great Hall, Draven made a quiet vow to himself, staring out at the snow-covered peaks that had swallowed Lyra's trail so completely all those years ago. He would not stop searching. He would not rest until he found the truth of what had become of her, no matter how long it took, or how far he needed to travel to find it. Whatever redemption remained possible after nearly a decade of silence and regret, he intended to pursue it with every resource available to him, driven by a guilt that had finally grown too heavy to carry alone any longer. The storm arrived with a violence that caught even the most experienced mountain travelers off guard. Dark clouds rolling in from the northern peaks with startling speed, transforming a clear autumn afternoon into a chaotic swirl of driving snow and howling wind within a matter of hours. Draven had led a small hunting party into the mountains that day, ostensibly to track a pack of raiders that had been harassing villages along Ashwood's northern border. But truthfully, he had welcomed any excuse to search the region where his scouts had last reported possible signs of a solitary Omega's presence years earlier. His companions, a seasoned tracker named Corwin and two younger warriors named Braddock and Elowin, had grown increasingly uneasy as the storm intensified, exchanging worried glances as visibility dropped to mere feet in front of them. Draven pressed forward regardless, driven by an instinct he could not fully explain, a feeling that pulled him deeper into the mountain, despite every rational argument for turning back toward safety. "We need shelter, now," Corwin shouted over the roaring wind, his voice barely audible through the swirling snow. "If we don't find cover soon, this storm will kill us before nightfall." Draven nodded grimly, scanning the white chaos around them for any sign of protection. They stumbled forward through drifts that had already grown knee-deep, their wolf senses dulled by the relentless wind that scattered every scent and sound into meaningless static. Braddock stumbled into a hidden ravine, wrenching his ankle badly enough that Elowin had to support his weight as they continued their desperate search for shelter. It was Corwin who first spotted movement through the blinding snow, two shapes emerging from the whiteout, with a confidence that seemed almost impossible given the storm's ferocity. Wolves, moving with purpose rather than the frantic disorientation that gripped the hunting party, their pale silver fur barely visible against the snow. Wolves, Braddock gasped, reaching instinctively for his weapon, despite his injured ankle. Territorial pack, probably drawn by our scent. But Draven raised a hand, stopping Braddock before he could act, some instinct warning him that these wolves carried no aggression in their approach. The two wolves circled the stranded hunting party at a careful distance, seeming to assess them with startling intelligence before one of them, larger and clearly male, let out a sharp, deliberate howl that seemed less like a threat and more like a signal. Moments later, both wolves turned and began moving away from the group, pausing every few steps to look back, an unmistakable invitation to follow. Draven exchanged a wary glance with Corwin, but with the storm growing more dangerous by the minute and no better options available, he made the decision to trust the strange behavior of these mountain wolves. "Follow them," he ordered, helping support Braddock's weight as the group struggled forward through the deepening snow. The wolves led them along a narrow, winding path that Draven would never have found on his own, navigating the treacherous terrain with a familiarity that spoke of countless previous journeys along this same route. After what felt like an agonizing eternity battling against the storm's fury, the wolves finally stopped before a sturdy cabin nestled against a rocky outcrop, its windows glowing with warm, welcoming light against the surrounding darkness. The two wolves shifted, and Draven found himself staring at two young people, a boy and a girl who appeared to be in their early teenage years, both breathing heavily from the exertion of guiding the stranded travelers through the storm. The boy stepped forward first, his expression cautious but not unkind. "You should not be out in weather like this," the boy said, his voice carrying an authority that seemed unusual for someone so young. "Come inside before the storm gets worse. My mother will want to help your friend with that ankle." Draven barely registered the words, his attention caught entirely by the boy's eyes, a striking, unmistakable silver that sent a jolt of confused recognition through his chest. He told himself it was simply a coincidence, a trick of the storm's strange light, but the feeling persisted, even as the group followed the two young wolves toward the cabin's welcoming door. Inside, warmth and the smell of wood smoke enveloped them immediately, a stark and welcome contrast to the brutal cold they had just escaped. Braddock was gently guided toward a chair near the hearth, while Elowin and Corwin shook snow from their cloaks, murmuring grateful thanks to their young rescuers. "Ren, fetch the healing herbs," the boy said, addressing his companion with easy familiarity. "I'll get more wood for the fire." The girl nodded and disappeared into an adjoining room, returning moments later with a small collection of dried herbs and clean cloth, kneeling beside Braddock with a competence that suggested significant experience treating injuries. Draven watched the exchange with growing fascination, still unable to shake the strange, persistent feeling that had gripped him since first seeing the boy's silver eyes. He glanced around the cabin, noting the careful, practical organization of the space, the shelves lined with preserved food and medicinal supplies, the evidence of a family that had built a genuinely self-sufficient life, far from any pack settlement. "Your parents," Draven said carefully, addressing the boy as he returned with an armful of firewood. "Are they here? We would like to properly thank them for your assistance." The boy paused, studying Draven with an assessing look that seemed far too perceptive for his apparent age. "Our mother is here. Our father lives elsewhere, far from this mountain." Something in the boy's careful phrasing sent an uneasy chill through Draven's chest, though he could not yet identify why the words affected him so strongly. Before he could ask further questions, a voice called out from the adjoining room, quiet but unmistakably firm. "Kale, Ren, is everyone settled by the fire? I'm bringing tea to warm our guests." Draven's entire body went rigid at the sound of that voice, memories rushing back with such force that he nearly stumbled where he stood. It could not be. After nearly a decade of fruitless searching, after countless nights spent wondering if she had survived at all, the possibility that fate had led him directly to her cabin during a chance storm seemed almost too improbable to believe. He turned slowly toward the doorway, his heart pounding with a mixture of desperate hope and overwhelming disbelief, just as a woman stepped into the firelight, carrying a tray of steaming cups, her expression calm and welcoming until her eyes met his across the room. The tray slipped from her hands, cups clattering to the wooden floor as recognition crashed over both of them simultaneously, nearly a decade of separation collapsing in an instant of shocked, breathless silence. "Lyra," Draven whispered, his voice barely audible above the storm still raging outside. She said nothing at all, simply staring at him with an expression that held equal parts shock, disbelief, and a carefully guarded pain that 9 years of exile had never fully healed. Behind her, Kale and Ren exchanged a confused glance, sensing the sudden, charged tension that had transformed the warm, welcoming atmosphere of their home into something far more complicated and uncertain. The silence stretched unbearably long, broken only by the crackling of the fire and the muffled roar of the storm still battering the cabin walls outside. Lyra stood frozen in the doorway, her hands trembling slightly as the shattered pieces of the fallen teacups lay forgotten at her feet. 9 years of carefully constructed peace threatened to collapse in this single, impossible moment. The man who had condemned her to exile, now standing in her home, seeking shelter beneath the very roof she had built with her own hands. Draven took a hesitant step forward, his silver eyes searching her face with an intensity that made her chest ache with old, unhealed wounds. "I searched for you," he said quietly, his voice rough with emotion he made no effort to hide. "For years, I need you to know that I searched for you." "You had guards remove me from the only home I had ever known," Lyra replied, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions churning beneath the surface. "You condemned me, without a single question in my defense. Forgive me, if your searching feels like too little, arriving far too late." Corwin, Elowen, and Braddock exchanged uncomfortable glances, clearly recognizing the weight of a conversation that extended far beyond simple pleasantries between strangers. Kale stepped closer to his mother, his posture protective despite his confusion about the exact nature of this unexpected reunion. "Mother," he said carefully, "who is this?" Draven's gaze shifted toward the boy, and something in his expression shifted as well. The shock of confronting Lyra momentarily overtaken by a fresh wave of stunned recognition as he studied the boy's face more closely. The sharp jawline, the confident bearing, and above all, those unmistakable silver eyes that mirrored his own, so precisely it felt like looking into a mirror, reflecting backward through time. "Kale," Draven repeated slowly, testing the name as though searching for confirmation of a truth he could barely comprehend. His gaze moved to Ren, standing quietly near the hearth, and he saw it there too. The same striking silver eyes, softened by a more thoughtful, watchful expression, but unmistakably identical in color and shape. He turned back to Lyra, his voice barely above a whisper. "They are mine." It was not entirely a question, though uncertainty still colored his tone, as though some part of him needed her confirmation, to fully accept a truth that had already settled into certainty within his heart, the moment he had looked into their matching silver eyes. Lyra's composure finally cracked, years of carefully suppressed grief and anger rising to the surface all at once. "Yes," she said, her voice trembling now despite her efforts to remain steady. "They are yours. Born alone, in this very cabin, during a storm not unlike the one raging outside tonight. I brought them into this world without a healer, without family, without a single person beside me who cared whether I survived the experience. You made certain of that when you cast me out, without asking whether I carried anything worth protecting." Kale's eyes widened as understanding crashed over him, his gaze shifting rapidly between his mother and the stranger who had apparently guided their hunting party to safety. "This is our father? The king you told us lived far away, following different rules?" "Yes," Lyra said simply, unable to soften the truth any further, now that it had finally been spoken aloud, after nearly a decade of careful concealment. Ren remained quiet, studying Draven with the same careful, assessing gaze she applied to any unfamiliar element of her environment, searching for information before forming judgment. Draven felt the weight of her scrutiny acutely, aware that these were not children who would simply accept him based on his royal title alone. They had grown up entirely independent of his influence, shaped by their mother's strength and the mountains' demanding wilderness, rather than by any privilege his position might have offered them. "I want you to know the truth," Draven said, addressing all three of them now, though his gaze remained fixed primarily on Lyra. "I discovered, months after your banishment, that Counselor Aldrich had orchestrated the entire attack that led to your false accusation. He sought power, and he found you convenient, an innocent target with no one to defend her. I have spent years trying to undo that grave injustice, searching for you across every territory bordering Ashwood, desperate to make amends for a mistake I should never have allowed to happen in the first place." "Aldrich," Lyra repeated, the name still carrying a sharp edge of remembered betrayal. "I suspected as much, though confirmation offers little comfort after everything his lies cost me." "I know," Draven said, his voice heavy with genuine remorse. "I know an apology cannot undo nearly a decade of hardship, cannot return the years you spent raising our children alone, cannot erase the pain I caused through my own cowardice and poor judgment. But I am asking, nonetheless, for the chance to begin making amends, however inadequate that chance might feel, given everything you have already endured." The storm continued to rage outside, wind howling against the cabin walls as though echoing the emotional turbulence within. Cale watched his parents with a complicated mixture of anger and curiosity, struggling to reconcile the image of a distant, unknown father with the reality of a king kneeling, both figuratively and increasingly literally, before his mother in quiet, earnest apology. "You banished her," Cale said finally, his voice carrying an edge of protective fury that startled even Lyra with its intensity. "You let her walk into these mountains alone, pregnant, without ever once asking if she was innocent. And now, you expect forgiveness, because you finally discovered the truth, years too late?" Draven met the boy's angry gaze without flinching, recognizing in that fierce protectiveness a reflection of his own better qualities, tempered and strengthened by a childhood built entirely on his mother's resilience and quiet courage. "I expect nothing," he said honestly. "I only hope for the opportunity to prove, through actions rather than words, that I am capable of becoming someone worthy of your trust, and your mother's forgiveness, however long that process might take." Ren finally spoke, her quiet voice cutting through the tension with unexpected clarity. "Actions take time to prove sincerity. Words offered during a single storm mean very little compared to consistent behavior over months, or years." Draven nodded slowly, recognizing the wisdom in her measured response. "Then I will show you consistency, for as long as it takes to earn even a fraction of the trust I forfeited 9 years ago." Lyra studied him carefully, searching his expression for any trace of the careless dismissal she remembered from that terrible day in the Great Hall. She found instead a man who seemed genuinely humbled, genuinely remorseful, though nearly a decade of hard-won independence had taught her not to place her trust easily, regardless of how sincere his apparent contrition appeared in this single, storm-tossed moment. "The storm will not clear before morning," she said finally, her voice carefully neutral. "You and your companions may stay until it passes, but do not mistake shelter for forgiveness, Draven. That will require far more than a single night's apology to even begin rebuilding." Draven nodded, accepting her terms without argument, grateful simply for the chance to remain near his newfound family, however tentative and uncertain that connection currently felt. As the fire crackled and the storm continued its relentless assault against the cabin walls, 5 lives that had been separated by injustice, distance, and years of painful silence found themselves unexpectedly reunited, standing at the beginning of a long and uncertain path toward whatever reconciliation still remained possible between them. Morning arrived with a fragile clarity, the storm finally exhausting itself sometime before dawn, leaving behind a world blanketed in pristine snow that sparkled beneath the pale winter sun. Inside the cabin, the tension of the previous night had not fully dissipated, though the initial shock had settled into something more complicated, a cautious, uncertain equilibrium among people bound together by blood and history, but separated by nearly a decade of pain and misunderstanding. Lyra rose early, as was her habit, moving through the familiar routines of preparing breakfast, even as her mind raced through the implications of the previous night's revelations. Draven had remained awake through much of the night as well, seated near the dying embers of the fire, his expression thoughtful and troubled, as he processed the weight of everything he had learned. Cale approached his father cautiously, as morning light filtered through the cabin windows, his earlier fury tempered somewhat by a night's reflection, though wariness still colored his every word and gesture. "You said Aldrich orchestrated the attack that led to my mother's banishment. What happened to him?" He has been stripped of his title and imprisoned, Draven answered honestly. Though I confess no punishment feels adequate given the years of suffering his lies caused your mother, and by extension, both of you. Imprisoned, Cale repeated, his jaw tight. While my mother spent 9 years surviving alone in these mountains, forced to build an entire life from nothing, because your council decided she was an acceptable target for their political games. Draven absorbed the accusation without defensiveness, recognizing the fundamental truth within Cale's anger. You are right to be angry. I offer no excuse for the failures that led to your mother's exile, only my genuine commitment to correcting them as thoroughly as circumstances now allow. Ren, who had been quietly observing the exchange while preparing herbs for the morning meal, finally spoke, her measured tone carrying an authority that seemed to command attention despite her youth. What does correcting them actually look like? You cannot undo 9 years of hardship with words alone. No, Draven agreed. I cannot undo what has already happened, but I can ensure the truth becomes publicly known throughout Ashwood, restoring your mother's reputation, and formally acknowledging the injustice done to her. I can offer both of you a place within Ashwood's court, should you wish to claim it, along with every resource and protection that comes with acknowledging you as my true heirs. Lyra, who had been listening from across the room, set down the kettle she had been holding, with more force than strictly necessary. You assume they want a place within your court, she said, her voice sharp with old, protective instinct. You assume this life, the one I built for them with my own hands, is somehow lesser than the palace you once used to condemn me without hesitation. That is not my meaning, Draven said quickly, recognizing the misstep in his careful phrasing. I only wish to offer them choices that circumstances previously denied them. Whatever they decide, whatever path they choose, I want them to know that the option exists, freely given, without any expectation attached. The tension in the room remained palpable, though something in Draven's careful correction seemed to ease Lyra's immediate defensiveness, if only slightly. She studied him for a long moment, searching for any trace of the careless authority that had once dismissed her pleas without consideration. Braddock, Corwin, and Elowen had remained largely silent throughout the exchange, sensing the delicate nature of a conversation that extended far beyond their role as simple travelers seeking shelter. Corwin finally spoke, his voice careful and measured. Perhaps we should discuss the practical matter of Aldrich's remaining allies within the council. If word spreads that the king has found his true heirs, certain factions may not react favorably. Draven's expression darkened at the reminder. Aldrich was not without supporters among the council, individuals who benefited from the chaos his lies created. Their loyalty to him may translate into resentment toward any threat to their continued influence. You mean my children may be in danger simply for existing, Lyra said flatly, her protective instincts flaring immediately at the implication. I mean that I will not allow any harm to come to them, under any circumstances, Draven said firmly. But I would be dishonest if I claimed the path forward holds no complications. Aldrich's remaining allies have spent years benefiting from the current council structure. The revelation of true heirs, born of an Omega they once helped condemn, may not be universally welcomed. Cale's expression hardened with renewed determination. Then let them test us. We have spent our entire lives learning to defend ourselves against far more immediate threats than court politics. Court politics can prove more dangerous than any storm or predator you have faced on this mountain, Draven warned, though a flicker of something like pride crossed his features at his son's fierce confidence. Manipulation, betrayal, poisoned words spoken behind closed doors, these are weapons far more insidious than claws or fangs. Then we will learn to navigate them, Ren said simply, just as we learned to navigate every other challenge this mountain presented us. Lyra watched her children with a complicated swell of pride and lingering fear, recognizing in their determined expressions the same fierce resilience that had carried her through nearly a decade of isolated survival. Whatever choice ultimately lay ahead for their family, she knew her children possessed the strength to face it, regardless of how complicated or dangerous the path toward reconciliation with Ashwood might prove to be. We will not decide anything hastily, Lyra said finally, addressing both her children and Draven with equal firmness. This mountain has been our home for nearly a decade. Any decision about returning to Ashwood, about claiming any inheritance or title, will be made carefully, with full understanding of the risks involved, and only when my children are genuinely ready to make that choice for themselves. Draven nodded, accepting her terms without argument. I will not rush you, or them. I have already cost you 9 years of the life we might have shared. I will not compound that failure by demanding a hasty decision now. As the morning progressed, and preparations began for the hunting party's eventual departure back toward Ashwood, a fragile but genuine foundation began forming among them, built not on immediate trust, but on the shared recognition that healing nearly a decade of injustice would require patience, consistency, and a willingness from everyone involved to move forward one careful step at a time. Lyra watched Draven prepare to leave later that day, his expression heavy with reluctance at the thought of separating from the family he had only just discovered. Before departing, he turned back toward her, his silver eyes carrying a sincerity that reminded her, despite everything, of the man she had once cared for before politics and fear had corrupted his judgment so completely. I will return, he said quietly, not to demand anything from you or our children, but simply to prove, through consistent presence, that my apology extends beyond empty words spoken during a single desperate night. Lyra said nothing in response, though something in her carefully guarded expression suggested that his words, however inadequate to undo nearly a decade of hardship, had at least begun the slow, difficult process of reconsidering judgments she had held tightly for far too long. True to his word, Draven returned to the mountain cabin within a fortnight, arriving alone this time, without the formal trappings of his royal position, dressed simply in traveling clothes that marked him as an ordinary traveler rather than a king. He carried with him a modest collection of supplies, tools for the workshop, medicinal herbs that were difficult to find in the mountain's immediate vicinity, and a carefully wrapped bundle of books that he hoped might interest 2 children who had grown up with limited access to written knowledge. Cale answered the door when Draven arrived, his expression guarded but no longer openly hostile. You actually came back, he said, unable to fully mask his surprise. I told you I would, Draven replied simply. Consistency requires more than a single visit. Over the following weeks, Draven returned regularly, each visit carefully spaced to avoid overwhelming the fragile trust beginning to form between them. He never pressed for immediate decisions about returning to Ashwood, never demanded acknowledgement of his royal title within the walls of Lyra's home. Instead, he simply showed up, again and again, offering practical help with tasks around the homestead, listening more than he spoke, and slowly demonstrating through consistent action the sincerity he had promised during that first storm-tossed reunion. He helped Cale repair a section of fencing that had been damaged during a recent storm, working alongside his son with a genuine willingness to learn skills that palace life had never required of him. He listened attentively as Wren explained her growing knowledge of herbal medicine, asking thoughtful questions that revealed genuine interest rather than polite condescension. He brought news of Ashwood's ongoing restructuring, careful to include both successes and continued challenges, refusing to paint an overly optimistic picture that might later prove dishonest. Lyra watched these interactions with cautious, evolving trust. She had spent nearly a decade building emotional walls thick enough to withstand any renewed disappointment, and she was not willing to lower them completely, based on a few weeks of promising behavior. But she could not deny that Draven's consistency, visit after visit, week after week, was slowly chipping away at the certainty she had once held that he was incapable of genuine change. During one visit, as autumn began transitioning fully into winter's harsher grip, Draven arrived with news that carried significant weight. The remaining members of Aldrich's faction have been formally removed from the council, he told them over a quiet evening meal. The transition was not without difficulty, but Ashwood's governance now rests in the hands of advisors committed to genuine justice rather than personal ambition. And what of the truth regarding my banishment? Lyra asked, watching him carefully. Publicly acknowledged, Draven confirmed. The full truth of Aldrich's manipulation has been shared throughout Ashwood. Your name has been formally cleared of any wrongdoing, and the injustice done to you has been recognized before the entire court. Lyra absorbed this news with a complicated mixture of relief and lingering bitterness. 9 years too late, she said quietly, though without the sharp edge that had colored similar statements during their first reunion. Yes, Draven agreed, offering no defense against the accuracy of her observation. 9 years too late, but acknowledged nonetheless, and permanently recorded within Ashwood's history, ensuring that no future council can claim ignorance of the truth, or attempt to revise it for their own convenience. Cale, who had been listening quietly, finally spoke with a question that had clearly been weighing on him for some time. If we were to consider returning to Ashwood, even temporarily, what would that actually mean? Would we be expected to abandon everything we've built here? Draven considered the question carefully before responding. I would never ask you to abandon this home, or the life your mother built for you here. This mountain has clearly shaped both of you into remarkable individuals, and I would not wish to erase that formative experience, even if such a thing were possible. But I would hope, eventually, that you might consider dividing time between both worlds, allowing yourselves the opportunity to know Ashwood, to understand your heritage, without ever feeling forced to sacrifice the freedom and resilience this mountain has taught you. Ren studied her father with the same careful, assessing gaze she had maintained since their first meeting. And if we choose never to claim any formal title or inheritance, if we decide this mountain remains our only true home, then I will respect that choice completely, Draven said without hesitation. I have already learned the painful cost of making decisions without genuine consultation. I will not repeat that mistake with my own children, regardless of what choice they ultimately make. The sincerity in his voice seemed to finally settle something within Lyra's carefully guarded heart, though she remained silent throughout this particular exchange, allowing her children the space to form their own opinions, rather than influencing their decisions through her own complicated feelings toward Ashwood and its king. As winter deepened and Draven's visits continued with unwavering consistency, a gradual thaw began forming within the careful walls Lyra had maintained since that first shocking reunion. She found herself, almost against her own expectations, beginning to trust the changed man, who now knelt beside her hearthfire, discussing practical matters of homestead repair, rather than the distant, authoritative king she remembered from nearly a decade earlier. One evening, after Cale and Ren had retired for the night, Draven remained by the fire with Lyra, the comfortable silence between them, carrying none of the tension that had characterized their earlier interactions. I know I can never fully repay what you lost, he said quietly. The years alone, the fear of childbirth without support, the constant burden of protecting our children single-handedly, against every hardship this mountain presented. I carry the weight of that failure every single day. Lyra studied the fire for a long moment before responding, her voice softer than it had been in any of their previous conversations. I built something remarkable here, Draven, something I am genuinely proud of, despite the pain that led to its creation. I do not need you to spend the rest of your life drowning in guilt over choices you cannot undo. I need you to continue proving, through consistent action, that you are capable of being the father our children deserve, and perhaps, in time, someone I might learn to trust again as well. Draven met her gaze with quiet, sincere hope. Then I will continue proving it, for as long as it takes, and gladly. As the fire crackled softly between them and winter's cold pressed harmlessly against the sturdy cabin walls, a fragile but genuine foundation for reconciliation continued strengthening, built patiently through consistent presence rather than empty promises, offering the possibility, however uncertain, of healing wounds that had once seemed permanently unbridgeable. Spring arrived on the mountain, with its usual gradual transformation, snow retreating from the lower slopes to reveal the first hints of green, pushing through soil that had lain frozen for months. It had been nearly a year since that fateful storm had reunited Lyra with the king who had once condemned her, and in that time, patient consistency had accomplished what no single apology could have achieved alone. Cale and Ren had grown noticeably during those months, not merely in physical stature, though both had grown taller and stronger through continued training, but in their understanding of the complicated world beyond the mountain's protective isolation. They had made several careful visits to Ashwood alongside their father, testing the waters of a heritage they were only beginning to fully understand, always with the option to return to their mountain home whenever they chose. Ashwood's court had received them with a mixture of curiosity and genuine welcome, the truth of their mother's unjust banishment having thoroughly transformed public sentiment regarding the entire affair. Villagers who once might have viewed an Omega's exiled children with suspicion, instead regarded Cale and Ren with something approaching admiration, recognizing in their capable, self-sufficient bearing a strength that palace-raised children rarely possessed. Lyra herself had made the difficult decision to visit Ashwood only twice during those months, each visit brief and carefully controlled, unwilling to fully immerse herself in a world that still carried painful memories, despite the genuine progress toward reconciliation. She remained, by choice, primarily on the mountain, continuing the life she had built with such determined resilience, though she no longer viewed Ashwood with the same bitter resentment that had once colored every thought of her former home. It was during a formal gathering in early spring, called specifically to address the lasting consequences of Aldrich's betrayal and formally restructure Ashwood's council, that Draven made a decision that would finally bring nearly a decade of injustice to its true resolution. Standing before the assembled court, with Kale and Wren present alongside him, Draven addressed the gathered nobles and commoners, with a solemnity that silenced even the most restless corners of the great hall. Nearly 10 years ago, he began, his voice carrying clearly through the vast chamber, I made a grave error, that I have spent every day since attempting to correct. I condemned an innocent Omega to exile, based on manipulated evidence and a counselor's ruthless ambition, without extending her the basic courtesy of a genuine investigation or fair trial. That failure cost her nearly a decade of hardship, forced her to raise our children entirely alone in unforgiving wilderness, and represents the single greatest regret of my entire reign. Murmurs rippled through the assembled crowd, though none dared interrupt as Draven continued, his gaze finding Lyra, who stood at the edge of the hall, having agreed reluctantly to attend this particular gathering at her children's gentle insistence. I cannot undo the years already lost, Draven continued, but I can ensure that Ashwood formally and permanently acknowledges the truth of what occurred, restoring Lyra's honor completely and unconditionally, and recognizing our children, Kale and Wren, as my true and rightful heirs, regardless of whatever choice they ultimately make regarding their own futures within this court. He turned then, walking the length of the great hall until he stood directly before Lyra, and to the astonishment of the gathered court, knelt before her in a gesture of formal apology, rarely offered by any reigning king, regardless of circumstance. I am asking, before this entire court, for your forgiveness, he said, his voice carrying clearly, despite its quiet intensity. Not because I believe I have fully earned it, but because I want every person in this hall to understand the full weight of the injustice you endured, and the sincere respect I hold for the extraordinary strength you demonstrated in building a remarkable life for our children despite that injustice. Lyra stood silently for a long moment, the weight of the entire court's attention pressing against her as she considered her response. She thought of the cold dismissal she had once received in this very hall, the guards who had marched her toward exile, without a single voice raised in her defense, the years of solitary struggle that had followed. But she thought, too, of the patient consistency Draven had demonstrated over the preceding months, the genuine transformation she had witnessed in a man once blinded by grief and poor judgment, and the remarkable children that shared uncanny strength drawn from both their parents. I do not offer forgiveness easily, she said finally, her voice steady and clear enough to carry throughout the silent hall. 9 years cannot be erased by a single apology, however sincere, but I have watched you, these past months, prove through consistent action that genuine change is possible, even for those who have committed grave failures of judgment. For the sake of our children, and for the possibility of a future built on honesty rather than convenient assumptions, I am willing to accept your apology, and to allow the possibility of trust rebuilding slowly between us. A visible wave of relief swept through Draven's expression, though he remained kneeling, unwilling to rise, until Lyra herself gestured for him to stand. As he rose to his feet, the assembled court erupted into a mixture of applause and emotional murmurs, witnessing what many would later describe as the true beginning of a new era for Ashwood, one built on genuine justice rather than the convenient manipulations that had nearly destroyed the kingdom from within. In the months and years that followed, Lyra never fully abandoned her mountain home, choosing instead to divide her time between the wilderness that had sheltered and strengthened her family and the court that had finally acknowledged the truth of her innocence. Kale and Wren grew into their dual heritage with remarkable grace, embracing both the practical resilience their mother had instilled in them and the responsibilities their newly acknowledged position within Ashwood demanded, always carrying with them the fierce independence that nearly a decade of mountain life had carved into their very character. Draven governed with a wisdom tempered by genuine humility, forever changed by the painful lessons of his earlier failures, determined never again to allow convenience or fear to override the careful pursuit of truth and justice within his court. And on quiet evenings, when storms rolled across the distant mountain peaks that had once sheltered an exiled Omega and her extraordinary children, Lyra would sometimes stand at the window of her beloved cabin, watching the lightning illuminate the ridges where she had once faced the harshest trials of her life, entirely alone, and feel nothing but quiet gratitude for the remarkable, unlikely journey that had ultimately led her family toward a future built on truth, resilience, and hard-won reconciliation.